End this quickly. Victoria Ashford whispered to herself as she stared at her reflection in the ornate mirror of the Grand Hotel Denver's bridal suite, her trembling hands adjusting the pearl buttons on her wedding dress for the 100th time that morning. But she wasn't referring to the ceremony that would begin in just 2 hours. She was talking about the conversation that would either destroy or strengthen her marriage before it even truly began. The moment when she would finally tell Christopher Bennett the devastating truth she'd been hiding for 8 agonizing months. The elegant silk gown concealed more than just her body. It hid the evidence of a rare degenerative disease that was slowly stealing her future one day at a time, leaving her with an impossible choice between protecting the man she loved from heartbreak or condemning him to a life of watching her deteriorate before his eyes. What Christopher would discover when he removed her wedding dress later that evening would test their love in ways that neither of them had ever imagined possible, proving that sometimes the greatest act of love is sharing your darkest burden with the person who promises to stand by you through sickness and health, even when sickness might mean losing everything you've dreamed of building together. Victoria had met Christopher Bennett 18 months earlier at a charity gala in Denver, where his reputation as one of Colorado Territory's most successful railroad engineers had made him the center of attention among society women seeking advantageous marriages. But Victoria hadn't been interested in his money or status. She'd been captivated by the way he'd spent the entire evening talking to her about books, travel, and dreams for the future rather than trying to impress her with his accomplishments. Christopher was 32 years old, tall and handsome with kind brown eyes and the calloused hands of someone who'd built his fortune through honest work rather than inheritance or speculation. Their courtship had been a whirlwind of romantic dinners, theater performances, and long walks through Denver's tree-lined streets as they discovered a compatibility that felt almost too perfect to be real. Christopher treated Victoria with the respect and affection she'd always hoped to find in a husband, listening to her opinions about politics and literature with genuine interest rather than the patronizing indulgence that most men showed toward women's thoughts. He'd proposed on a snowy December evening 6 months after they met, presenting her with a diamond ring and promises of a future filled with love, travel, and the family they both wanted to create together. But by then, Victoria had already begun experiencing the subtle symptoms that would eventually reveal themselves as the early stages of Hutchinson-Gilford progeria syndrome, an extremely rare genetic condition that caused accelerated aging in adults. The first signs had been easy to dismiss: unusual fatigue, minor skin changes, and joint stiffness that she attributed to stress from planning their wedding and managing her deceased father's estate. Victoria's family physician, Dr. Edmund Hartwell, had initially diagnosed her symptoms as nervous exhaustion brought on by the emotional strain of losing her parents within 2 years of each other. It wasn't until 3 months before her wedding that Dr. Hartwell referred her to a specialist in Boston, where a series of comprehensive examinations revealed the horrifying truth about her condition. Dr. Marcus Whitfield, one of the few physicians in America who'd studied progeria, explained that Victoria's case was extraordinarily rare. Most patients with her condition died in childhood, but she'd somehow survived to adulthood only to face accelerated deterioration that would claim her life within 2 to 5 years. The disease would age her body at approximately 10 times the normal rate, causing her organs, muscles, and skin to deteriorate rapidly while her mind remained intact to witness every stage of the process. The diagnosis had shattered Victoria's world more completely than her parents' deaths, not because she feared dying, but because she couldn't bear the thought of subjecting Christopher to the pain of watching her transform from the vibrant woman he'd fallen in love with into someone he might not even recognize. The medical literature Dr. Whitfield had provided painted a grim picture of progressive weakness, dramatic physical changes, and inevitable organ failure that would make her completely dependent on others for basic care. Victoria couldn't imagine asking the man she loved to sacrifice his dreams of marriage and family to become her caretaker and eventual nurse. The months leading up to their wedding had been a masterpiece of deception as Victoria learned to hide her symptoms behind carefully applied makeup, strategic clothing choices, and an acting performance that would have impressed professional theater critics. She'd canceled social engagements when her fatigue became too obvious, blamed her increasing frailty on wedding stress, and used every cosmetic trick available to conceal the subtle but progressive changes in her appearance. Christopher's natural consideration and busy work schedule had made the deception easier, as he attributed her occasional absences and mood changes to normal pre-wedding anxiety rather than terminal illness. Now, standing in her bridal suite on the morning of October 15, 1892, Victoria faced the moment she'd been dreading since receiving her diagnosis. Tonight, in the privacy of their marriage bed, there would be no hiding the physical evidence of her condition from the man who'd just pledged to love her in sickness and health. Christopher deserved to know what he was truly committing to, and Victoria had finally found the courage to trust that their love might be strong enough to survive even this devastating test. The afternoon sun streamed through the stained glass windows of Denver's First Presbyterian Church as Christopher Bennett stood at the altar, his heart racing with anticipation and a love so profound it made him feel dizzy with gratitude for the fortune that had brought Victoria Ashford into his life. He'd spent the morning reviewing railroad construction plans for the new line that would connect Denver to the mining camps in the high country, but his mind had been completely occupied with thoughts of the woman who would become his wife in just minutes. Christopher had built bridges across impossible canyons and laid track through mountain passes that other engineers declared impassable, but nothing in his professional life had prepared him for the overwhelming emotion of watching the church doors open to reveal his bride walking toward him in ethereal white silk. Victoria moved down the aisle with the grace that had first caught Christopher's attention at that charity gala, her face partially hidden behind a delicate veil that somehow made her green eyes even more luminous and mysterious. She carried herself with the poise of someone born to privilege, but Christopher had learned during their courtship that her elegance came from strength of character rather than mere social training. Victoria was intelligent, compassionate, and surprisingly well-informed about subjects that most society women ignored, able to discuss everything from railroad engineering to territorial politics with insights that consistently impressed him. As she approached the altar, Christopher noticed something different about Victoria's appearance that he couldn't quite identify, a subtle change in her complexion that made her look almost translucent in the afternoon light. She seemed smaller somehow, more fragile than he remembered, though he attributed the observation to the emotional intensity of the moment and the natural nervousness that affected most brides on their wedding day. Victoria had been under considerable stress organizing their wedding while managing the complex legal issues surrounding her father's estate, and Christopher had noticed that she tired more easily than she had during the early months of their courtship. Reverend Patterson's voice carried clearly through the packed church as he began the traditional ceremony that would bind Christopher and Victoria together in the eyes of God and Colorado territorial law. The pews were filled with Denver's most prominent citizens, railroad investors, mining executives, and the social elite who considered themselves essential guests at any significant wedding. But Christopher was barely aware of their presence. His attention focused entirely on the woman beside him, whose hands trembled slightly as she repeated her vows with a voice that was softer than usual but filled with unmistakable love. "Do you, Christopher Bennett, take Victoria Ashford to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, till death do you part?" Reverend Patterson's words carried extra weight in the solemn atmosphere of the church, each phrase a sacred promise that Christopher was eager to make with complete sincerity and absolute commitment to honoring every aspect of his vows. "I do," Christopher replied firmly, his voice carrying the conviction of someone who'd found his life's purpose in loving and protecting the woman beside him. He'd meant every word of those traditional vows, but the phrases about sickness and health had particular resonance because he'd already decided that his love for Victoria was strong enough to weather any challenge life might bring them. Christopher had seen enough frontier hardships to understand that marriage required partners who could support each other through difficulties that would test their commitment in ways they couldn't anticipate. Victoria's own vows were spoken with quiet intensity, her green eyes meeting his directly as she promised to love, honor, and cherish him through whatever circumstances their future might hold. But Christopher caught something in her expression that looked remarkably like desperation, as if she were making promises she wasn't certain she could keep or asking forgiveness for something he didn't understand. The emotion in her voice was so profound that several guests were moved to tears. Interpreting her passionate delivery, as evidence of deep romantic feeling rather than the complex mixture of love and anticipated loss that actually motivated her words. The kiss that sealed their marriage was gentle and reverent, tasting of tears that Christopher attributed to happiness, but that carried flavors of grief and regret that Victoria tried to keep hidden. As they turned to face their guests as husband and wife, Christopher felt a surge of protective tenderness toward his new bride, noticing again the subtle fragility in her appearance that made him want to shelter her from any hardship or disappointment that might threaten her well-being. He had no idea that the greatest test of their marriage was already present in Victoria's body, waiting to reveal itself with devastating clarity. The reception at the Grand Hotel Denver was an elegant affair that showcased Christopher's success and Victoria's impeccable social training. But both bride and groom moved through the celebration with minds focused on the private conversation that awaited them in their bridal suite. Victoria smiled and accepted congratulations with practiced grace, while internally rehearsing the words that would either destroy or strengthen their marriage before their wedding night was over. Christopher noticed that she barely touched the elaborate dinner, claiming excitement had stolen her appetite, though he also observed that she seemed to have difficulty cutting her meat and frequently rubbed her wrists as if they were causing her pain. "You look tired, sweetheart," Christopher murmured during a quiet moment between toasts, his concern evident in the way he studied her face for signs of the exhaustion he'd noticed with increasing frequency over the past few months. "Are you feeling well? We can retire early if you need rest." His solicitous attention was both touching and heartbreaking to Victoria, who knew that his protective instincts would soon be tested in ways that might prove too much for even the most devoted husband to handle. "I'm fine," Victoria replied with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Just overwhelmed by everything. It's been such a perfect day." The lie came easily after months of practice, but each deception felt like another weight added to the burden of guilt she carried about entering marriage under false pretenses. Christopher deserved honesty from his wife, particularly about something that would affect every aspect of their life together. But Victoria had been paralyzed by fear that the truth would drive him away from her when she needed his love most desperately. As evening shadows lengthened across Denver's bustling streets, the newlyweds finally excused themselves from their reception to retire to the hotel's finest suite, elegantly appointed with French furniture and crystal chandeliers that created an atmosphere of romance and luxury. Christopher had spared no expense in ensuring that their wedding night would be as perfect as money and careful planning could make it, arranging for champagne, flowers, and privacy that would allow them to begin their married life in surroundings worthy of his love for Victoria. But as they climbed the grand staircase toward their suite, Victoria's steps grew heavier with each floor, weighed down not by her elaborate gown, but by the knowledge that the next hour would determine whether their marriage could survive the devastating revelation she was about to make. Christopher attributed her obvious nervousness to natural bridal modesty, having no idea that his wife was preparing to share news that would challenge everything he thought he knew about their future together. The bridal suite's golden lamplight cast dancing shadows across the ornate wallpaper as Victoria stood by the window, her wedding dress rustling softly with each nervous movement, while Christopher carefully removed his formal jacket and vest with the reverent anticipation of a man about to begin the most intimate chapter of his marriage. The silence between them was heavy with unspoken expectations and hidden fears, broken only by the distant sounds of Denver's evening traffic filtering through the hotel's thick walls. Victoria's hands trembled as she began to remove her jewelry, each piece feeling like armor she was reluctantly discarding before facing a battle that would determine whether her marriage survived its first night or crumbled under the weight of devastating truth. "Victoria," Christopher said gently, moving to stand behind her and placing his hands on her shoulders with the tender care of someone who'd noticed her obvious distress. "You've seemed troubled all evening. I know this day has been overwhelming, but we're married now. Whatever's worrying you, we can face it together." His voice carried the calm certainty of a man who'd solved engineering problems that others considered impossible, confident that love and determination could overcome any obstacle that threatened their happiness. Victoria closed her eyes at his touch, memorizing the feeling of his strong hands supporting her because she wasn't certain how much longer she'd be able to feel such simple comfort without the shadow of her condition coloring every interaction. "Christopher," she whispered, her voice breaking on his name. "There's something I need to tell you before tonight goes any further. Something I should have told you months ago, but I was too afraid of losing you." The change in her tone made Christopher's hands still on her shoulders, his engineer's mind immediately recognizing the gravity in her voice that suggested this wasn't about wedding nerves or maidenly modesty. He turned her gently to face him, his brown eyes searching her face with growing concern as he took in the pallor that makeup couldn't quite conceal and the way she seemed to have aged subtly since their engagement photos were taken. "What is it, sweetheart? Whatever it is, we'll handle it together. I'm dying," Victoria said simply, the words hanging in the perfumed air between them like a physical blow that made Christopher stumble backward a step. "I have a rare condition called Hutchinson-Gilford progeria syndrome. It's causing my body to age at an accelerated rate. The doctors say I have perhaps 2 years, maybe less." The clinical explanation felt inadequate for describing the horror of watching her own body betray her, but she forced herself to continue. "I wanted to be your wife, even if only for a short time, but I understand if you can't, if this changes everything." Christopher's face went through a series of emotions: shock, disbelief, anguish, and finally a determination that surprised Victoria with its intensity. "How long have you known?" he asked quietly, his voice steady despite the devastation clearly visible in his eyes. "How long have you been carrying this burden alone?" The question carried no accusation, only the pain of someone realizing that the woman he loved had been suffering in silence while he remained obliviously happy. "Since 3 months before our wedding," Victoria admitted, tears flowing freely now that the truth was finally spoken. "I wanted to tell you, but I couldn't bear the thought of watching you walk away. I know it was wrong to deceive you, to let you marry me without knowing what you were committing to, but I loved you too much to give up the chance of being your wife, even briefly." Instead of the anger or rejection Victoria had feared, Christopher moved closer, his hands framing her face with infinite gentleness as he looked into her eyes with an intensity that took her breath away. "Show me," he said quietly. "I need to understand what we're dealing with, what you've been hiding from me." His request wasn't born of morbid curiosity, but from the practical need of someone preparing to fight a battle he didn't yet fully comprehend. With shaking hands, Victoria began to unfasten the pearl buttons that ran down the back of her wedding dress, each one requiring Christopher's assistance as her fingers had grown increasingly stiff and weak over the past months. The elegant silk fell away to reveal the devastating evidence of her condition that no amount of careful clothing or makeup could conceal. Her once smooth skin showed the mottled texture and unusual pigmentation characteristic of accelerated aging. Her muscle mass had decreased noticeably, and her joints showed the swelling that marked the disease's progression. Christopher's sharp intake of breath was audible in the quiet room, but it wasn't the sound of revulsion Victoria had expected. Instead, it was the gasp of someone seeing for the first time the magnitude of suffering his beloved had been enduring alone. "My God, Victoria," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "How have you been bearing this by yourself? How have you been functioning, working, planning our wedding while dealing with this?" His hands moved over her arms and shoulders with the reverent touch of someone assessing damage while promising protection. "The pain isn't constant yet," Victoria explained quietly, wrapping her arms around herself in a gesture of self-protection that broke Christopher's heart. "But it's getting worse, and the doctors say it will progress rapidly now. My organs will begin failing, my mobility will decrease, and eventually..." She couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't voice the clinical details of how her life would end. Christopher was quiet for a long moment, his engineer's mind processing information and formulating plans even as his heart broke for the woman he loved. Then he moved to the wardrobe and retrieved his traveling robe, wrapping it around Victoria's shoulders with the gentle care of someone handling something infinitely precious. "We're going to Boston," he said with the decisive tone he used when announcing major construction projects. "Tomorrow. I'll wire Dr. Whitfield tonight and arrange for you to be examined by every specialist on the East Coast. There have to be treatments, experimental procedures, something the doctors here haven't considered." "Christopher, you don't understand," Victoria protested, though her heart leaped at his refusal to simply accept her fate. "This condition is so rare that most physicians have never seen a case. The few specialists who've studied it all agree that there's no cure, no treatment that can slow the progression. The best they can offer is pain management. The word palliative died on her lips as she saw the stubborn determination in her husband's expression. Then we'll find doctors who disagree, Christopher said firmly, sitting beside her on the edge of their marriage bed and taking her hands in his with the same confidence he'd shown when tackling engineering challenges that others considered impossible. We'll travel to Europe if necessary, consult with physicians in London, Paris, Vienna. There are medical advances being made every day, experimental treatments that might not be available here in Colorado. I won't accept that there's nothing to be done without exhausting every possibility. Victoria stared at her husband with wonder and growing hope, unable to believe that his reaction to her devastating news was to immediately begin planning their fight against it rather than mourning the future they'd lost. You don't want to annul the marriage? You're not angry that I deceived you? The questions revealed her deepest fears about his reaction to her revelation. Christopher's answer came not in words, but in the kiss he pressed to her forehead, tender and reverent, and filled with promises that transcended their wedding vows. I married you in sickness and in health, Victoria. I meant every word of those promises, and this doesn't change my commitment to you. If anything, it makes me more determined to make every day we have together count for something meaningful. His voice carried the absolute conviction of someone who'd found his purpose in protecting and cherishing the woman he loved. As they held each other in the golden lamplight of their bridal suite, Victoria felt something she hadn't experienced since receiving her diagnosis: hope. Not just hope for extended life or miraculous cures, but hope that she wouldn't have to face the most terrifying journey of her life alone. Christopher's love was proving to be exactly what she believed it was during their courtship: strong enough to weather any storm, deep enough to provide refuge from any fear, and committed enough to transform what should have been the worst news of their lives into the beginning of the greatest adventure they would ever share together. 6 months later, Victoria Bennett sat in the garden of a private clinic in Vienna, Austria, watching Christopher review architectural drawings for yet another treatment facility they would visit in their relentless quest for answers that might extend her life or ease her suffering. The journey that had begun on their wedding night with her devastating confession had taken them across 2 continents and through the offices of dozens of specialists, each consultation adding to their knowledge while confirming the grim reality that medical science in 1893 had no cure for her rare condition. But something miraculous had happened during those months of travel and uncertainty. Their love had deepened rather than weakened under pressure, transforming from romantic infatuation into something far more precious and enduring. The experimental treatments they'd pursued in Boston, London, and now Vienna had slowed some symptoms while managing her pain more effectively than anything available in Colorado, giving Victoria precious additional months of mobility and relative comfort. Dr. Heinrich Müller, the Austrian physician who'd become their greatest ally in the fight against her disease, had developed a combination of medications and therapies that couldn't cure her condition but had dramatically improved her quality of life. More importantly, he'd treated Victoria as a whole person rather than just a medical curiosity, helping both husband and wife understand how to make the most of whatever time they had together. Christopher had surprised everyone, including himself, with how naturally he'd adapted to becoming Victoria's primary caregiver and medical advocate. The engineering skills that had made him successful in railroad construction translated perfectly to navigating complex medical systems, researching treatment options, and coordinating the logistics of their international medical odyssey. But his greatest talent had proven to be his ability to see beyond Victoria's physical deterioration to the brilliant, loving woman whose spirit remained completely unchanged by her body's betrayal. Dr. Müller thinks the new electrical therapy might help with the joint stiffness, Christopher said, setting aside his papers to focus completely on his wife, who was wrapped in warm blankets despite the mild spring weather. He's seen improvement in other patients with similar symptoms, and the procedure is completely painless. His voice carried the cautious optimism that had sustained them through months of disappointing test results and failed treatments, always looking for the next possibility rather than dwelling on the limitations of current medical knowledge. Victoria smiled at her husband's irrepressible hope, marveling at how his determination to fight her disease had never wavered even when her own faith in finding answers had dimmed. "And if it doesn't help?" she asked gently, not to discourage him, but to ensure they remained realistic about her prognosis while still pursuing every avenue that might extend their time together. Her condition had progressed noticeably during their travels, her mobility decreasing and her physical appearance changing in ways that no amount of careful grooming could disguise. But her mind remained sharp and her love for Christopher had only grown stronger. "Then we try the next treatment, and the one after that," Christopher replied with the stubborn determination that had initially frustrated Victorian doctors who preferred patients who accepted their pronouncements without question. Dr. Mueller mentioned a colleague in Switzerland who's experimenting with mineral water treatments that have shown promise for degenerative conditions. And there's a new research facility opening in Munich that's specifically studying rare genetic disorders. His refusal to give up hope had become the foundation of their marriage, the rock upon which they'd built a life that was meaningful despite its anticipated brevity. The truth that neither of them spoke aloud was that Victoria's condition was progressing faster than even the most pessimistic medical predictions had suggested. The 6-month journey that was supposed to buy them years together had perhaps bought them additional months, and those months were becoming increasingly precious as her body's systems began the final stages of deterioration. But rather than making them desperate, the approaching reality of loss had made every day they shared feel like a gift to be treasured rather than a tragedy to be mourned. "Christopher," Victoria said quietly, reaching for his hand with fingers that were increasingly stiff but still capable of conveying infinite love through touch. "I need you to promise me something." Her request carried the weight of conversations they'd been avoiding, practical discussions about the future that would arrive sooner than either of them wanted to acknowledge. "When the time comes, when I can no longer be the wife you deserve, I need you to promise that you'll continue living, that you'll find happiness again, maybe even love again." The pain that flashed across Christopher's face was immediate and profound, but he didn't reject her request with the automatic denials that had characterized his responses to similar conversations in the past. "I can't imagine loving anyone the way I love you," he said honestly, his voice thick with emotion. "But I can promise that I'll honor your memory by living the kind of life you'd want me to have. I'll build the things we dreamed of building together, travel to the places we planned to see, maybe even help other families dealing with rare medical conditions." Victoria's eyes filled with tears of gratitude rather than sorrow, recognizing the gift Christopher was giving her by acknowledging that their love was strong enough to include letting go when the time came. "You've given me something I never expected to have," she whispered, her voice carrying the wonder of someone who discovered treasure in the midst of loss. "You've made me feel completely loved for exactly who I am, not despite my condition, but including it. You've shown me that dying doesn't have to mean that living was meaningless." The months that followed were a masterclass in making the most of limited time, as Christopher and Victoria returned to Colorado with a new understanding of what their marriage could accomplish even under impossible circumstances. Christopher established a foundation dedicated to funding research into rare genetic conditions, using his business connections and Victoria's social position to raise awareness and money for medical research that might help future patients. Victoria began writing detailed accounts of her experiences with progeria, creating medical documentation that would help physicians better understand the condition, while also recording her thoughts about love, mortality, and finding meaning in suffering. Their home became a gathering place for other couples dealing with terminal illnesses, as Christopher and Victoria discovered that sharing their story gave hope to people facing similar challenges. The love that had sustained them through their darkest moments proved to be contagious, inspiring others to fight harder for every precious day, while also teaching them to let go with grace when fighting was no longer possible. Victoria's courage in facing her condition with dignity and Christopher's devotion in caring for her without losing himself became legendary throughout Denver's medical and social communities. The end, when it came 18 months after their wedding, was peaceful rather than traumatic, surrounded by love rather than fear. Victoria died in Christopher's arms on a snowy December morning, her last words expressing gratitude for a marriage that had been brief but complete, meaningful beyond anything either of them had dared hope for when she'd first revealed her devastating secret on their wedding night. Christopher's grief was profound but not bitter, tempered by the knowledge that they'd made the most of every moment they'd been given together. Years later, when the Christopher and Victoria Bennett Foundation had funded breakthrough research that led to new treatments for progeria and other rare genetic conditions, Christopher would speak to medical students and young couples about the power of love to transform even terminal diagnoses into opportunities for meaningful living. He never remarried, not because he couldn't love again, but because his love for Victoria continued to inspire his work and give purpose to his life long after her death. Their story became a testament to the idea that love's true measure isn't duration but depth, that some marriages achieve in months what others never accomplish in decades. Victoria's detailed medical journals became essential reading for physicians studying progeria, while her personal writings about facing terminal illness with courage and grace were published as a book that helped countless patients and families navigate their own journeys through serious medical challenges. The love story that had begun with devastating revelation and impossible choices had evolved into a legacy that continued to heal and inspire people decades after both husband and wife were gone, proving that some kinds of love are truly strong enough to conquer death itself, not by preventing it, but by transforming it into something that serves life. This incredibly powerful story of love conquering the ultimate test reminds us that true devotion isn't measured by how long we have together, but by how deeply we choose to love while we can. If Christopher and Victoria's journey through terminal illness strengthened by unshakable love moved your heart, please subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell, because everyone needs to hear stories that show us how to find meaning in the face of life's greatest challenges. Share this beautiful testament to devoted love with someone who needs to remember that even our darkest moments can become our most meaningful when we face them together. Tell me in the comments which moment touched you most deeply. Victoria's courage in revealing her secret, Christopher's unwavering commitment to fight alongside her, or their beautiful legacy of helping others find hope in hopeless situations. Your engagement helps these life-changing stories reach others who desperately need inspiration to keep fighting their own battles. What story of love transcending impossible circumstances should we explore next? Remember, you are stronger than you know, more loved than you realize, and capable of creating meaning even in the midst of unthinkable challenges.